Welcome to Ongossy. I am your host, Fred Wellman. Chaos reigns in Washington, D.C., and meanwhile, Joe Biden's flying around the world, building coalitions, making deals, and getting stuff done. You know, that's the exact same opening I used last week. I mean, literally, I went to update the script and I was like, oh, shit, that's the exact same thing. And so I didn't update it. And that tells you exactly where we are in the world about right now. It's a freaking mess. The House GOP can't even agree on rules to pass spending bills, no matter actually passing the bills. They are truly openly at war with themselves now, which we totally saw coming. If you watch the show for even a day, you know, it's a disaster. And, you know, we're going to talk about that, but I got a great guest to talk about some other big issues that are going on now. So let's get right at it. All right, welcome. I am your host, Fred Wellman. This is On Democracy with me, FP Wellman. You're in the right place. We have shut down almost assured as the House GOP fights. And of course, the big news story that everybody's talking about right now is the dress code in the Senate. Because I don't know. I don't understand anything right now. I think I do. Every time I think I know what's going on in the world, they do things like worry about the dress code in the Senate. Meanwhile, the good news keeps coming for Democrats. The Republicans just don't see it coming. I think they're incapable of changing their ways. As we heard this week on Tuesday, there was a couple of special elections, and Republicans lost a special election in New Hampshire in a very Trump district, nearly losing control of the state house in New Hampshire they've had for a while. A Democrat, Hal Rafter, won in a landslide, and now the GOP margin in the New Hampshire House is only 198 to 197. And there's another special election on November 7th in a Democrat heavy district. And so you're going to have an evenly divided break there. In Pennsylvania, they also lost control of the state house. Control of the Pennsylvania state has just flipped to the Democrats because of a special election. If you were with us last week or a couple weeks ago, we had Simon Rosenberg on. I think that brings, I want to say 40 special elections since Dobbs that Democrats have outperformed in every day. Right? And this now they keep doing it. So, you know, but the thing is, one of the hottest topics for me this week, especially, if you saw the video I did for MeidasTouch about the Meet the Press interview with the baffling debut of Kristen Welker, where she gave an hour to let Donald Trump lie his ass off, and the frustration a lot of us have had with how the media normalizes that conversation and normalizes Trump as a Republican candidate. And luckily for me, once again, you know, I always get the guest with the best timing, and so I've got the perfect guest to discuss that. So I want to welcome Eric Deggans. He's the NPR's first full-time TV critic and media analyst, providing coverage across, well, we were joking in the pre-show about he covers all of the vast network of NPR. He's been a journalist for 3 decades and lives in Tampa Bay area. Most importantly, he's the author of Race Baiter, How the Media Wields Dangerous Words to Divide a Nation, written about a decade ago, which we're going to talk about right there. You got to plug the book, right? And it's available on Amazon and it delivers in just a couple of days. I know. It's a terrific book. So welcome to the show, Eric. I really appreciate you taking time in your busy schedule for us. Thanks for having me. Well, let's just jump off the ropes at the top there, right? So I know you didn't, I don't know if you talked about it yet, but a lot of us are kind of aghast at the launch of Meet the Press. One of the things I highlighted in the video I did, and it's probably inappropriate, but you know, was the fact that, of course, the Trump campaign teams, Jason Miller had a little steak dinner a month ago in Milwaukee before the debate. Kristen Welker attended, a number of them attended. We never heard much about that. A month later, Donald Trump is the exclusive guest on the very first new Meet the Press, and it showed a lot of things. And I'd love to get your opinion on that. But for a lot of it, felt like the media still doesn't know how to handle him, which is shocking to me after, 8 years? I mean, what do you see from something like that? And how do your colleagues handle a Donald Trump?
Yeah, it is really difficult to handle someone who basically the center of his worldview is based on a lot of lies.
Right.
And these are lies that he insists are true. And these are lies that are sometimes complicated and tough to parse out, particularly in a live setting. Now, you know, NBC and Meet the Press tried to address that by pre-taping the interview so that they had an ability to parse what he was saying, and if he said something that they felt, I guess, was beyond the pale, they could not include it or include some context. You know, she talked with Peter Baker from the New York Times, also. But I think in the end, when you have somebody who is the Republican, seems to be the front runner for the Republican nomination, and constantly says things that aren't true, and says them in a way that is difficult. It's difficult to stop him.
Yeah.
It's difficult to fact check him. It's difficult to introduce the new material. One of the things that I have been encouraging and others have been encouraging journalists to do in the Trump era is to do what we call a truth sandwich, where if you have to say that someone said something that's untrue, for example, if Donald Trump is indicted for efforts to overthrow the election because he believed that he had won the election,
right?
Then you say before you introduce the clip that this isn't true, that he did lose the election. And then you have the clip of him saying what he believes. And then after that, you also say, well, nothing that he says has any basis in fact, and that he did indeed lose a free and fair election.
Right.
And that way, at least the lie is sandwiched in between, two elements of truth. And, it's impossible to do that when you're having a conversation with someone in the way that interview was structured. I do think that you're in a situation where Trump is not going to agree to an interview with a mainstream news outlet.
Right.
Where they change the rules substantially,
right,
or where they say they're going to do a robust fact checking, or they're constantly interrupting him
right,
when he says something, that's untrue. So you're in a situation where, you're making yourself vulnerable to broadcasting a lot of things that he says are untrue, even if you try to correct them after he said them, or somehow around what he said. You still wind up platforming a lot of untrue information.
Right. And into and normalizing so much of it. Right. I mean, I think they tried, Weekly to put up a fact check website after the event. It's like, it's far too late at that point. And that was something it's funny. I did tweet that out saying, I'd love to know what the agreement was. Cause you and I know, and I was a PR guy. I was on the other side. I was the guy pitching these things. Right. And I know pitching the media, like you're going to have the framing of it. They're going to have like, here's what's on and off, what's fair game, what's not. And it had to be several pages of discussion to get to a point where he did his first mainstream media interview, but it was I think it was disappointing to a lot of us. I mean, a lot of us feel like, and for me especially, the conversation around the interview afterwards, and I think there was an interview, as a clip of her and Dana Bash talking, and it's just like he's like, yeah, he's really leaning into how he's going to differentiate himself from Biden, and how he's a deal maker, and it's like all this normal shit. It's like, yeah, but what about the part where he's been indicted 4 times with 91 charges against him? Like, can we lean into that? And it just, I think a lot of us are having flashbacks to 2015 where he just became, they enjoyed him too much. I mean, you and I,
Well, part of the problem that hosts like Kristen Welker are going to confront is that when you have a set of candidates or a set of politicians who insist that things are not true,
right,
that are true,
right,
if they are committed to this idea that Trump did not lose, the election against Joe Biden, then you're placed in a situation where you have to constantly challenge them when they come on your air, and then they decide they don't want to face that kind of challenging. So then you can't get Republicans to come on your show.
Right.
And so, I think aside from having a really an interview that got a lot of attention for her first, program as the moderator of Meet the Press, it was also a signal to Republicans, hey, you can come on and we won't grind you into the ground by constantly challenging all of these, untrue things that you are saying. But unfortunately, what that does is it puts the program in a situation where they're platforming a lot of nonsense, and the moderator isn't adequately challenging them.
Right.
And so part of the problem is wanting to have access to people to come on your show. The other problem is that TV needs to have a certain, these interactions need to have a certain energy. They need to have a certain flow. And if the moderator is constantly interrupting someone who's talking every time they say something that's not true, then it makes the moderator look bad, and it makes the whole interview uncomfortable to watch, and it's not great television.
Yeah.
So that's the other pressure that TV people face, and that often results in these interviews not being as revelatory as you would like.
Yeah.
The moderators often don't know how to press people when they constantly say things that are untrue in ways that are still TV friendly and in ways that don't leave them looking terrible.
Yeah.
If you look at somebody like Mehdi Hassan,
I was just thinking, you read my mind.
MSNBC,
Yeah.
you know, he's come up with a way, of course, to constantly challenge people, but he does run the risk of sometimes looking like a jerk.
Yeah.
Because you bring somebody on your show and you won't let them move on from something they've said until they admit that what they said is not true, or it becomes kind of a cartoonish confrontation.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think TV reporters in particular have not figured out how to deal with this. They've not figured out how to challenge people like that in the moment and communicate that so much of what they're doing is either based on things that have not been proven or based on things that are demonstrably untrue.
Yeah, I mean, we're through the looking glass in a post-truth era in every way. I mean, we have an entire party that's dedicated themselves to not seeing reality, and then they have a media ecosystem in many ways that supports that, right? With the Fox News ecosystem, and it kind of goes, which is a great place to talk about your book, right? I mean, it's the book it's over a decade old. You wrote it in 2012, and when I got it and I was going through, I'm like, okay, this was bad then, but I'm not necessarily sure. It's like, right. I mean, that's it. I was going to say, well, shit. I mean, you had a call to arms. I mean, you did a call to arms. So we have to have a more civil discourse. We had to have the media understand their role in the destruction of institutions. But here we are 11 years later, or 12, and in many ways it's, and the media landscape has changed. I mean, does it just make you a little bit crazed, I guess? I'm looking for the right word when you know what you wrote and the moment, and you could probably explain better than me why you wrote why Race Baiter came about. But the idea being that many in the media, they're not even aware that they're encouraging this uncivility, the race, especially around race discussions. I mean, that's really a lot of the focus is. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I mean, now 11 years later.
Yeah, I mean, I originally wrote the book because I was covering media and television for the St. Petersburg Times newspaper here in Florida.
Yeah.
And I was constantly doing these stories sort of piecemeal. And so when you're doing stories for a newspaper, obviously there's a lot of stuff you can't put in because the story can't be, super long.
Yeah.
So I had a lot of material that I wasn't able to put into my stories just because I didn't have room for it. And then I also realized that not a lot of people were doing really incisive and detailed and well researched books about this phenomenon yet. So I decided to try and pull together all the things that I had about how different media outlets were dealing with race and usually not dealing with them well, and also how some media outlets were weaponizing prejudice and stereotypes and things like that in order to boost their viewership,
right.
And in fact build a bond with their viewers that's about demonizing certain kinds of people and pulling other people in and being very definitive about who the accepted people are, who this broadcast is for, and then who is not part of that group.
Yeah.
And often the people not in that group were non-white people and gay people.
Right.
We weren't even really talking that much about transgender people back then, but they'd be in that group now.
Yeah.
So, we're in a situation now where instead of people acting to try and save the way in which we connect to each other and talk to each other about contentious issues, and the way in which America kind of converses with each other. Instead, the lesson that too many people have learned is that anger and division and demonizing people, that all is a really successful engagement strategy. And so we have more and more platforms utilizing that engagement strategy, regardless of how badly it is destroying the nation's social fabric. I mean, this is a nation that is founded on the idea that we welcome people in and they bring their distinct heritage and history, and it becomes part of this greater thing that is an amalgamation of all the things that all of us have brought to the table as Americans.
Yep.
And instead, what some of these outlets are constantly promoting is that there's one acceptable way to be an American, and anything that doesn't fit in that is to be rejected and demonized and feared. And in the process, it may help their page views and ratings and engagement, but it destroys the cohesion that we feel and the ability that people have to agree to disagree sometimes.
Yep.
And beyond that, we're to the point now where so many stances are taken not because of facts, but they're taken because of political ideology that people don't even know what facts to believe in anymore. And our process for figuring out, when we were confronted with a pandemic that was at a level that we hadn't seen in 100 years, figuring out the very natural process of public health entities trying different strategies to contain that pandemic, some of them working, some of them not. All of that was poisoned by political process. And every time they tried something that wasn't as effective as people wanted it to be, that was taken as some sort of sign that the whole idea of fearing this pandemic or taking certain measures to contain it was invalid. And the only reason some people were taking those positions is because it was politically expedient for them. And so that's where you really start to scratch your head and wonder, what are people thinking? I mean, when we decided we were going to enter World War II and take on the Axis powers, there wasn't this moment where everybody sort of stood around and said, well, let's debate whether or not the Nazis are actually exterminating Jewish people.
Right.
Or let's sit around and talk about whether or not, the Japanese forces actually killed people at Pearl Harbor, or whether they were crisis actors.
Exactly.
Where's the proof? We didn't have those kind of conversations.
Debate me.
We were able to have our debates about whether or not we should enter the war based on actual facts and what was actually happening. And now, when we're faced with these sort of world-defining strategies, we are hampered by the fact that a good portion of our discourse is based on things that simply are not true. And we're not talking about facts. And so, you make decisions that are likely to be faulty because you're not really considering what's actually happening out there. And the only way that spell gets broken occasionally is when a calamity comes along where the facts of it are so massive, you can't deny it. When a pandemic comes along and it kills hundreds of thousands of people, at some point you have to acknowledge the reality of it. When a recession comes along and it throws hundreds of thousands of people out of work, and I'm talking about 2009, you kind of have to recognize it. You can't deny it anymore. And so, but it's taking greater and greater calamities to shake people out of this craziness and get them to face facts regardless of their ideology. And I fear for what it will take next to shake people out of this sort of bizarre love for ideology over fact.
I mentioned that I was the executive or the chief of staff of a COVID field hospital, and we were veterans who ran that in New York. And it was all special operations veterans and all. And one of my big jobs as administrative chief of staff of the hospital was managing our employees. And I'm not going to lie, we actually had a guy, he volunteered and got accepted, whose mission was to prove COVID was fake. This is April. This is right after it started. And I was getting messages from friends in South Carolina. I have a friend who was actually a West Point classmate saying, this is all BS. You're forcing me to shut my company down because a bunch of people in New York, it was shocking to me that we had a position like that where, truth was divergent, just actual truth was divergent. And going back to the book and the timeline we're talking about, a decade since then, do you think the shifting media landscape I think even when the book came out, it was brought, and it was Bill O'Reilly is the guy who called you a race baiter. I mean, it almost seems like a halcyon time that Bill O'Reilly was a, you know what I mean? And now we've had the arc of Tucker Carlson, who's now on X/Twitter now. I mean, so the media we digest is, look at MeidasTouch Network, where my show appears, the MeidasTouch Network. They've got over 1.5 million subscribers and every show I post, you'll see the comments. They're wonderful. Thank you, Mighty, for being so nice. But you'll see a lot of people like, I don't watch news anymore. I get it from this. I come here to see what's really going on. So we won't even have we have different facts. We have different sources of said facts in such a diverse
this
way.
is something that I warned about in the book.
Yeah.
One of the things I talked about was that Fox News' strategy for galvanizing viewers, part of it was this something that hadn't really been done in journalism before. In the past, when journalism platforms compete, they would say, we get the story faster.
Right.
We get the story more accurately. We get the story in a way that is more comprehensive. We do a better job as journalists. But the New York Times would never say, the Washington Post actively lies to you. The New York Times would never say CBS is telling you things that aren't true in order to serve a political agenda.
Yeah.
Fox News came along and said, our competitors are lying to you. Our competitors are not being truthful. They're not practicing truthful journalism. You have to come to us to get the truth.
Yeah.
And so number one, of course, that's not true.
Yeah, there's that.
Number two, what it does is it destroys people's faith in all journalism.
Right.
Because you can't go to people and say, all these other outlets that the world has told you, try very hard to be truthful. And when they're not truthful, it is usually a mistake.
Right.
If all of that is not true, then, why would I believe that this one outlet that's telling me this is exempt from all of that? Right. Eventually, a lot of people would say, okay, maybe all those other outlets are lying to me, but this one can't be perfect either. All journalism is terrible. And so it winds up creating an environment where no one can believe the facts that they're presented, or even believe that the media outlets they're consuming are presenting what they believe to be facts in good faith. Right. And that's the thing that gets at the heart of why journalism works in America. There's a sense that if you're reading the New York Times or if you're listening to NPR and you hear something that either turns out to not be true, or you hear something that you think is a little off base, it's happening because someone made a mistake, or it's happening because someone didn't necessarily fully report out the story, or it's happening because someone made an assumption that might not have been accurate. But, 80 or 90% of the time, those are good faith errors. People are trying to present material that they think is true, but they may fall short. Yep. There may be a small segment where there's someone who has some sort of preconceived notion that they insist on reflecting in a story. And I'm not saying that doesn't happen. Right. But I am saying that it's been my experience as somebody who's worked for over 30 years in mainstream journalism. Most of the time, people are trying really earnestly and hard to deliver the facts, even when they get things wrong. If people stop believing that, and if they believe that every news outlet is actively trying to fool them, then you reach a point where we can't agree on the simplest facts, and our whole information system breaks down. Yeah. And that's what the people who are pressing these ideas to make money and not acknowledging the social harm they're causing, this is what they're really creating. They're creating a situation where even the people who are their audience, who trust them, don't fully trust them, because they're bought into the notion that everything that they see in the media is some sort of creation with a political goal behind it.
Yeah. And that's a great place to take a pause. We've got some great sponsors this week, as always, and we'll hear from them. This episode of On Democracy is sponsored by our friends at BetterHelp. It feels like fall here in Missouri. Life's picking up speed. It's festival season. Election season's kicking off. School's back. Work's kicking up. All these things. I find it so easy to get caught in what everyone else needs from me this time of year and never take a moment to think about what I need for myself or you for yourself. I've always struggled this time of year with important life milestones, work, and of course the changing seasons as we head into winter. I think because so many of us spend so much of our time working hard to keep up and giving to others, I can leave us feeling stretched thin, burned out, and kind of frazzled, to be honest with you. I've found for years now that therapy has given me the tools to find more balance in my life, so I can keep supporting others without leaving myself behind. In my life, I've been very, very fortunate to find therapy is incredibly helpful It's helped me for learning positive coping skills, how to set boundaries, and generally how to become a better version of myself. I want you to know that therapy isn't just for those who've experienced major life difficulties or challenges or trauma. It is for everyone because of what you are going through every day. Well, it matters. So if you're thinking about starting therapy, I highly recommend you give BetterHelp a try. Now, it's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. I started my therapy journey online and it changed my life. With BetterHelp, you just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed actual therapist. And you can even switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. I think you should find more balance in your life with BetterHelp. So what I want you to do is just visit betterhelp.com/Fred today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/Fred, and start your therapy journey today. Hey, look, everyone knows how annoying cheap razors are. The cuts, the irritation, the frustration, and don't get me started on subscription razor services. The headaches they can cause if they show up on your doorstep. That's why you got to meet Henson Shaving. Henson Shaving is a family-owned aerospace parts manufacturer that's made parts of the ISS and the Mars rover, and now they're bringing precision engineering to your shaving experience. And I'm an old pilot, so I love me some aerospace manufacturing, let me tell you. Now, razor blades are like diving boards. The longer the board, the more wobble. The more wobble, the more nicks, cuts, and scrapes. A bad shave isn't a blade problem, it's an extension problem. By using aerospace-grade CNC machines, Henson makes metal razors that extend just 0.0013 inches, which is less than the width of a hair. That means a secure and stable blade with a vibration-free shave. It gets better. The razor has built-in channels to evacuate hair and cream and makes clogging virtually impossible. So seriously, Henson Shaving wants the best razor, not the best razor business. That means no plastic, no subscriptions, no proprietary blades, and no planned obsolescence. The Henson razor works with standard dual-edged razor blades to give you that old school shave, like me, with the benefits of new school tech. So once you own a Henson razor, it's only about, $3 to $5 per year to replace the blades. So I tell you, I don't shave often, obviously, but my first shave with the Henson razor was incredibly refreshing. The design is sleek and the durability is top notch. The Henson razor is truly so much better than your run-of-the-mill razor, and it's the quote-unquote traditional razor brand that you're used to. Now, the affordability factor is absolutely game-changing. No more wasting your money on expensive blades. With Henson Shaving, you can get like a year of blades for around $5. So it's time to say no to subscriptions, say yes to a razor that's lasts you a lifetime. Visit hensonshaving.com/Fred to pick the razor for you and use code FRED, and you'll get 2 years worth of blades free with your razor. Just make sure to add them to your cart. 2 years of blades. So that's 100 free blades when you head to hensonshaving.com/Fred and use code FRED when you're there. Check them out. And we're back. That's it, and that is the truth problem, right? That what are facts, and I think you live in Florida, and you're right there on ground zero where history is being rewritten. And I've talked to a lot of my Black friends, and they're just horrified. I had Michael Harriot on the show about a month ago, and Michael just dismantles the whole thing in a very direct. He's got a new book coming out, Black History AF, which I'm really looking forward to, and it's the same sort of thing. And for me, that is there. One of the things I say in the show a lot, Eric, is I say that what people call culture war. Like a lot of folks have dismissed the issue of these new facts and the presentation of history as a culture war issue, but I live in Missouri, right? You live in Florida. People there's real impact to these culture wars. People are losing their lives. Transgender youth and transgender adults are being forced out of their healthcare system and back away. People are moving away from Missouri right now. And the culture war is a real war because there's real victims of these wars. I mean, what's the impact do you think? I mean, as you see this, the government now is aggressively changing the curriculums, aggressively we throw the F word around a lot, fascism. I know it's distasteful to a lot of people, but it's hard not to see it. What do you see that from your perspective as an observer of media, an observer of this fact system, if you will?
Well, what I would say is that what really saddens me about all of this is that, again, these politicians, and we're seeing a lot of them at the state level in Florida.
Yeah.
These politicians are building their careers and building their support on this idea that this has to be a war, that somehow white kids are being intimidated in classrooms. And so parents have to fight back and it has to be a contentious issue. But the point of fact is that it doesn't have to be a war. If we are focused on the facts that we know happened in the past, and we're focused on being honest about those facts, it doesn't have to be a conflict. It doesn't have to be a situation where people feel shame. It can just be a situation where you acknowledge what happened.
Yep.
And then you try to talk about what it means for the world that we're living in today. And it's not always a situation where people of color or women are looking at, white people and males and saying, you oppressed us. Here's a constant story of oppression.
Right.
Anyone who studied American history knows that it's a very convoluted and complex situation. America, right after the end of the Civil War, was a very different place than America before and during the Civil War, and America, 40 or 50 years after, when the redemption had really settled in, and white politicians had started to claw back the voting rights that Black males had in the wake of the Civil War, and started to take away Black wealth and target Black people through lynchings. So, the story in America has always been progress and setbacks, and progress and setbacks, progress and backlash, progress and backlash.
Yep.
And one of the things that the people who control most of the wealth in America, one of the things they've done very successfully is that they've convinced rank and file white people that they have less in common with people of color who are in their same socioeconomic status than they do with the white people who run everything. And this goes all the way back to the Virginia slave codes. Back hundreds of years ago, when we first saw laws created to officially recognize white people having a little bit more privilege, the average white person having a little bit more privilege than Black people, because they realized in Virginia they'd had something called Bacon's Rebellion, where indentured servants who were white and enslaved people who were Black had banded together to try and force the moneyed, wealthy white men who ran that state to be fairer to all of them. Yep. And they realized they had to do something to break up that coalition. So they passed what are now called the Virginia Slave Codes. And so, we look all the way to today, and we see how working class white people are constantly propagandized and told to fear undocumented immigrants, told to fear Black people, particularly in cities, told to fear gay people and transgender people, when often they have much more in common with those people than they do with the Mitch McConnells of the world, or they do with Tucker Carlsons of the world. And those people have a vested interest in breaking up any sort of coalition that might be formed between working class white people and working class non-white people to force the ruling classes in this country to pay them a better wage, to have a workable system of bringing in immigrants who we need to work jobs, and then making sure they get paid a fair wage when they're in this country and they have access to the Social Security benefits that they're already paying, even when they work as undocumented workers. We have a dysfunctional immigration system, in part because this nation has a hard time acknowledging that there are a great deal of people who work in a lot of industries who don't get paid minimum wage, who don't access Social Security benefits, even though they're paying into the system, who don't access local amenities, even though they're paying through sales taxes and state taxes, they're paying taxes.
Yep.
We're bringing people in, paying them less, taking money from them in taxes, and then turning around and demonizing them for coming to the country in the first place.
Yep.
So, there's all these systems that are set up to funnel money from the many to the wealthy who run this country. And one way that's enabled is through these media outlets that encourage a severing of connection between groups that have a lot in common because, they have the same socioeconomic status, they're working the same jobs, they have the same goals for their families. And that to me is the saddest thing about what's happening in Florida is, some politicians are saying it's a war, but it's a war because they want it to be a war. Right. It doesn't have to be a war.
Right.
It can be a conversation.
Right.
And it can be about, reading this book and reading that book and talking about the ideas in both of them. But instead, you have legislators in Tallahassee who are telling local school boards how to teach in local communities, and that's never made any sense.
No, and it really plays out in the UAW strike right now, right? That the if you see the comments of the Republican candidates, especially, I think Tim Scott just came out saying, "Oh, if they go on strike, they should be fired." and when you look at the details of that strike, which I have done, is they haven't had to pay, they gave up their benefits. They gave up things in 2008, 2009 during the big crash when the companies were going to go bankrupt, and then they've never gotten them back. They haven't had a pay raise. I mean, the starting pay for a factory worker in UAW is $16 an hour. I mean, I was shocked at that number. Well, $16 to work in a factory.
And one of the issues they talk about is that they cut a deal so that newer workers would get paid less.
Yeah. That was part of the deal. It went down. It was 19.
Workers,
it was 19 before.
Workers would make a lot more, but the new workers are getting paid at a much lower rate. So, but again, we're in a situation where people are not debating facts.
Right.
If we had a situation where Republican candidates and Democratic candidates could debate on the merit of the facts and talk about why it makes sense to support unions in America or why it might not make sense, and we're all talking about facts. That's a debate I would love to see happen. But instead, Tim Scott quoted Ronald Reagan, who fired air traffic controllers.
Right.
It's an entirely different industry. It was 30 years ago, an entirely different economic time.
Yeah.
It almost felt like a flippant answer that wasn't really connected to the facts of the current moment.
Yeah.
And that to me is what I think made him look bad, is that, he wasn't really talking about where we are today, and he wasn't talking facts. You didn't even have a sense of whether he even knew the issues that were at play, in the strike.
Yeah, none of them.
And who can support somebody for president who isn't aware of the details of a historic strike that is threatening one of America's linchpin industries.
I mean, did you see him? Did you see where he talks about? I'm sorry.
That's the problem. Yeah, we're not talking about facts,
and we're living in a different era of facts. And I mean, because he in an earlier thing, I think it's in a video I did for Meidas, he literally talks about, I have this friend, my prayer buddy or something, I don't even know how to go there, who was doesn't have a high school degree, and he worked in the steel industry, and he was making six figures a year some years through his hard work because he worked hard. And I swear to God, I was waiting for him to say, if these auto workers would just stop eating avocado toast in Starbucks. I mean, it was such a disconnected from reality statement to highlight a guy who was in a different industry decades ago. I was at a fair this weekend. Someone very dear to me, their father worked at Caterpillar. I'll just say Caterpillar. And this gentleman we were talking to had worked there as well. And he talked about a friend of his who retired at 62, like 20 years ago from Caterpillar. Like, that was a different time. You had full benefits. You had full, and they gave all that up in 2008. And it just seems just this disconnect. And that does go back to our media framing that. And it was frustrated within our peers in the media not framing that. They get focused on there was like a 4-day work week proposal, 30, that was all they talked about. And they're not framing the idea that you don't understand. These auto workers gave up what had been the cornerstone foundation benefits of their industry in 2009, and now their companies are making record profits, and they got none of it back. And I get frustrated because the media is failing to frame that story at all.
I will have to say I'm not familiar. I'm not as familiar with the intricacies of what.
It's a lot too. I had to do some homework. I'm not gonna lie.
May have given up, so I don't. I don't know if I can co-sign all of that. But what I can say say is that, again, number one, we say the media when really we're talking about cable TV news and we're talking about
that's fair.
TV news outlets.
Yeah.
And I would hazard a guess that you could pull up the New York Times, you could look at coverage from NPR, you could look at coverage.
Yeah, I
PBS
know.
News
I have
Hour.
to eat that one, Eric. I have to eat that one, Eric. Yeah.
You can look at coverage from a bunch of other outlets that are not mainstream TV outlets, and you will see more nuanced coverage and more, context. So that's one thing.
I do agree, and I eat that one.
That's one thing I would say. But the other thing is when you reject facts and you reject a scientific approach to things or a respect for how science works, another thing that you do is you get overly reliant on anecdotes. Yeah, and it is easy to meet one or two people whose personal stories reflect the way you want to see the issue. Yeah. But, I grew up in Gary, Indiana in the 70s and 80s. That was when the steel industry cratered. And local steel companies went from employing something like 30,000 people to employing 10% of that, something like 3,000 people. Wow. Right. So we had a system where if you didn't go into the military or go to college, you would probably go work in the steel mills and you could earn a middle class living. Yeah. If you got a decent job there. And there was a whole progression. There were tons of people who would come out of the high schools, they would get a job there, they would get their first decent car, they would get their first decent place living away from their parents. They would find a great person to settle down with and get married, and then they would start to raise a family. And all of that was funded by the great jobs that the steel industry offered. And when those vanished, in a place like Gary, there was no industry that could absorb those workers. There was no other place that people who didn't have a college degree, especially, could get jobs that paid that well. Right. And so the economy of the entire area cratered. And so, Tim Scott may have a friend who earned six figures at some point in the past, but I have lots of friends who lost, their economic stability when the steel industry vanished. Yeah. And unlike some lucky cities like Pittsburgh, they weren't able to find a secondary economy to replace it. Yeah. And the town was devastated. So there's a real need, obviously, to talk about facts when we talk about these issues, instead of relying on anecdotes that may be true for one person or may be true for a couple of people, but they are probably not true for a huge swath of most of the people, which that's what you have to be talking about when you're talking about something as expansive as a labor agreement. I really appreciate that. And I think that's a great place also to kind of, before I let you go, I want to ask one question. I saw you had such a great discussion recently about the idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion and why it matters. I've watched the way the right has turned those were essentially innocuous terms like CRT and DEI. I mean, in Missouri, they almost shut down the government by accident. I'm not making this up, because some legislators wanted to outlaw DEI programs and not do business with contractors that have DEI programs, and somebody figured out, that's everybody. You're going to have to shut down, in their efforts to, to a lot of federal programs. Funny thing that, exactly. And they'd be ineligible for federal. There's a whole host of them. But you explained it very well. And it goes to what we were just talking about, right? Is especially in the media, because we are talking media a lot, diversity, equity, inclusion in media. It does mean telling the right stories, right facts, because from where we are in our background, it matters, right? I mean, you talked about, I think you mentioned, the shooting in Texas as a good example. Could you expand on that a little bit? Sure. So, and this relates to something that NPR, I think, kind of experienced as a news organization. We went in to cover, of course, the mass shooting in Uvalde, and just a horrific situation. Yeah. But of course, what you find when you go into that community is that there are a bunch of Spanish-speaking Latino community members, and they have lives, and they have their community, and then you have the white folks who may not speak Spanish and are not necessarily part of that community. And telling the story really requires being able to talk to both elements of that community, and being able to move back and forth between them. And so, we were lucky in that we had reporters who worked for NPR who could speak Spanish, and they could go in and they could talk to people and they could find out how they pronounce things, something that simple.
Yeah.
How do they pronounce a town's name versus how white people pronounce the town's name? How do they pronounce certain people's names versus how, white people in the community might pronounce those things? And showing respect for how they pronounce things or how they talk about issues allows you to get to the whole of the story. You're not just telling the perspective of one part of the town. You're telling the perspective of the whole town. And in fact, you're trying to sort of figure out how to reconcile these two very different views sometimes of the same issue, the same incident, the same school, the same system, right? Because they're treated very differently. So when I talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion in journalism terms, I say it's part of accuracy. It's how you make sure that you're telling the full story and you're telling an accurate story. If a shooting happens in a certain neighborhood and the only perspective you get about it is from the police, you will not have the full story because the people who live in that community may know a lot more about what happened there than the police you ever find out. So it's the job of a journalist to sort of go in and try to get all those perspectives and then pull them together into a story that sort of explains to the community what happened. And, a journalist that I really respect who used to run the Poynter Institute for Media Studies here in St. Petersburg said, journalism keeps the community in conversation with itself. So you're constantly asking questions and you're constantly telling stories and you're constantly bringing up facts that keeps the community saying, oh, what happened over there and why did that happen? And what can we do to make it better or stop it from happening? Or, you know what I mean? And again, it all goes back to this idea that misinformation and disinformation really limits the conversation because it's hard to have a conversation with someone who has their own beliefs rooted in facts that are not true or that are substantially different than what they want to believe. And just the idea that because you believe in something strongly enough, that makes it true. That's what makes it hard to talk to people sometimes because you have to go to them and say, look, I know you really want to believe this is true, but it is not true. And you have to find a way to accept that. Because if you don't, then you will insist on believing something. It's like believing, to put it in completely crude terms, it's like believing that a road leads to a bridge when it leads to a cliff. And no matter how much you want to believe that road leads to a bridge, if it leads to a cliff, you are driving off a cliff. And so wouldn't it be better to listen to somebody who can see through the fog and tell you, no, that actually leads to a cliff. And you should stop driving before you get to it. And then once you stop driving and you see there's a cliff there, everyone can agree and they can figure out how to build that bridge. That's what we're missing. And so all of these issues, as you noted in this conversation, they all come back to each other because once we break down that community conversation, that journalists, that is part of our job to foster, then it makes it so much harder to achieve everything else that we want to do as a society.
That's perfect. I could end up. I was laughing. I was thinking too. The problem today would be even when we do see the cliff, they're going to say, "Well, it's Biden's fault. They're supposed to build a bridge there." we can't even agree. I know. We won't agree why there's no bridge.
At least if you see the cliff,
we know not to drive over it.
For its existence, you won't drive off it.
I hope so. But
we can have that conversation about whether it's Biden's fault that there's no bridge there, because at least you're recognizing that there's
a cliff. Exactly. Well,
the problem is when the denial gets to the point where we are denying.
And we're just driving off a cliff, and that's what we're all trying to stop. I think that's what we're trying to. That's why I do here is like how we stop. And I don't mind being wrong. It's funny. I did that thing where I said, "Oh, the media is doing something," and you're gonna laugh, and I'll let you go, Eric, because I am actually that guy that did that thing. Because no shit, when I was prepping to discuss the UAW strike. This is so embarrassing. I actually used a CNN story. So anyway, I'm that guy, Eric. I had to miss. So listeners, dear listeners, I'm the guy that did that thing, but you're right. I mean, you got to dig for it, though. This touches
on one other thing that I'll just mention very quickly, which is that modern mainstream media can be frustrating because it can be accurate and it can be misleading in the same moment.
That's a great way.
The New York Times will have amazing stories, and then they also have stories that have you scratching your head and going, Kristen Welker is a terrific example.
Yeah.
She is a really great journalist and
Yeah.
has done amazing work. This one Donald Trump interview was disappointing, but I'm sure she's going to do great work on Meet the Press.
Yeah.
And I hope that people will give her flowers when she does it. But that's what's so hard for us, is we want to be able to place a label on something and dismiss it. But mainstream media is constantly justifying its existence and also doing things that disappoint us in the same moment all the time. And we have to figure out how to criticize when they make mistakes, when we make mistakes, without constantly condemning the whole institution because it doesn't deserve that.
Man, that's a great place, because that's exact. I'm a fan. I was a spokesman in the Army. The people I work with, double Pulitzer Prize winners in Iraq, and John Fisher Burns, the New York Times, legendary war reporter. I learned more about journalism standing on fobs, watching demonstrations of special forces troops than I did any school I went to. Just standing there with John Fisher Burns, and talking about journalism. I'm a fan of the whole thing, and so I do catch myself getting caught into this discussion, as I just did. I'm one of the people who just fell into that trap myself. So, Eric, thank you. I know you got to go. I appreciate your time. This has been educational and fascinating. I love being wrong every night. And I appreciate you being here for us, and keep up the fight.
Thank you.
Well, I did that thing. I'm gonna go back to that, and it's funny. And we just had a conversation in the after show with Eric too about that. It is hard to see it. I did have to dig to find out the details of the UAW strike. Having said that, I have to admit I found the details of the UAW strike and their demands via CNN and via New York Times website. I didn't see them on TV because they're very complex issues. So even me, who is sitting here trying to be a critic, a reasonable critic, fell into the trap of they're not covering that when they actually are. So I admit when I'm wrong, and I'm happy to admit when I'm wrong. Matter of fact, I'm happy being wrong. Matter of fact, if you know me, I'm wrong about every hour, so whatever. But I do think we do have to be careful. So I apologize for being that guy on the show, and I appreciate you guys being such loyal listeners. I tell you, thank you for joining the show. As you can see, it's fascinating conversations with Eric. If you were not familiar with him, the book is terrific. It's still as timely as it was a decade ago, and his work is incredible, especially as he talks about the transition from. We get a chance to talk about it, unfortunately, is the transition from mainstream, cable to broadcast to streaming and what that means. So anyway, I appreciate you being here. As you can tell, as always, I love your comments. I am on this show Friday nights. Usually I'm traveling this week, so hopefully I'll be there when you guys watch this. I love talking to you. I love your replies and love hearing from you. I appreciate your time. I appreciate you being loyal followers of the show. If you go on, if you've got Apple or podcast and your podcast, Spotify, Amazon, wherever, be sure to download the audio version if you're an audio listener, and leave a like, leave a share, leave a review on Apple. We appreciate it. It helps us get more viewers and listeners. In the meantime, we really appreciate you. As you know, Forgotten Democrats is really ramping up now as we go. I'm hearing a lot of really scary rumors, and that there are less. That we're going to have a cycle where I'm very nervous. We're going to have a lot of Republicans running unopposed this cycle. Shockingly, in this time where it could be a very contentious presidential election year, which means there'll be a big voter turnout, and I'm worried we're not going to have enough Democrats who are stepping up to run for office. So Forgotten Democrats, as I've mentioned before, is a very simple idea. The simple idea is a special FEC earmark that will allow us to fund with your money, specifically monthly donations we use, but monthly donations divided amongst all the Democratic nominees from the least first. So if you've got a guy who hasn't raised a ton of money because he's in an obscure district, he's in a very tough race, he's in a very tough gerrymandered area, but they deserve to put up a fight against a Republican. They deserve to, you as a citizen deserve to have a competitive election no matter what. Those are the guys who get the money first. They'll be funded from the bottom up. So I love the model. If you want to join our email list, it's very easy. It's 33777 to get our email list. You can go right to ForgottenDemocrats.org to join even better. Love to have you join us. In the meantime, you can follow us there, and I'd love you to be part of that movement as we go into the cycle, because it's September, folks. We're starting to talk about elections again, and it's that time, and we really need to help good people run for office. In the meantime, as you can know, you can always find us at FP Wellman. I'm still on X, FP Wellman. I'm on Threads, and I love Threads, FP Wellman Official, and Instagram, everywhere else. The show is on Democracy Pod. We can follow our YouTube channel as well, on Democracy Podcast on YouTube as well. We're adding some more stuff to that as we speak. We got some really cool stuff in the works. I can't wait to show you as we build out this wonderful community that we've built together. As always, Substack, fpwellman.substack.com. The Substack's got some, I'm adding a lot to Substack. I'm excited about that. So a lot of cool things coming because we're in the fall and it's time to start ramping things up. And I love you being a part of our community and part of the show. Thank you for joining us. We will see you next week. You know, this may shock you, but I'm a bit of a fan of good quality bath and body products. So I'm excited to introduce you to Sugar and Spruce. It's a woman and family owned and operated small business. It's all about making your bath time routine feel like a treat. At Sugar and Spruce, they believe that indulgence and self-care can go hand in hand. That's why they craft their products with the philosophy of fun, all while keeping them oh so good for you. It's all about finding the perfect balance, like a foam party for your senses, without any harsh chemicals or nasty preservatives. And guess what? They've got a little something for everyone under their umbrella. That's right, ladies, gentlemen, even the little ones can enjoy the magic of Sugar and Spruce bath products. It's a bath time extravaganza for the whole family. So, look, whether you're a bath aficionado, a bubble enthusiast, or just someone who wants to add a sprinkle of joy to your day and have a great start, Sugar and Spruce has you covered. They got bath bombs that sizzle, bath salts that transport you to a serene oasis, and handcrafted traditional soap, which I just love, to make your skin feel fresh and clean, as well as a line of products just for men. Support a women and family-owned business. A family, you might even recognize the name when you check it out. And treat yourself to some blissful bubbles today. Now, head over to their website today at sugarandspruce.com and give yourself the gift of indulgence by entering the code FRED, and you'll get 20% off your first order. That's right. If you shop online and use code FRED at checkout, you'll get a whopping 20% off your first order of handmade bath and body products straight from Fredericksburg, Virginia. That's Sugar and Spruce, SPRUCE.com. Sugar and Spruce bath products, where the everyday routines become extraordinary treats.